We're in our series, Therefore Believe, and as we pick up where we left off, Jesus had just been arrested. He was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. He has now been walked across the Kidron Valley and through the gate into the old city of Jerusalem. And the spotlight last week was on Peter, right? Peter comes and really he bears the weight as really the leader of the disciples. He bears the weight for the other disciples who also, by the way, didn't show up. Only John will be recorded at the cross when we get there. And now Jesus is in his final hours before the cross, and he's gone in front of the Jewish leaders. He's had his trial, quote unquote trial with the Jewish leaders, the Sanhedrin, and now they're going to march him to the Roman officials, and now he's going to have his trial before the Roman government. Before we get into the passage, we have to understand Pontius Pilate. There's a real history, a depth of history we have to understand before we can ever begin to understand what his motives are in this passage. So Pontius Pilate, I like to say, I don't like to say it, I've heard it my whole life, it's not what you know, it's who you know. It's not what you know, it's who you know. And so Pontius Pilate, he served as the Roman prefect or the governor of the region of Judea from AD 26 to AD 36. He had a very short 10-year reign within those times. And he was appointed by the Roman Emperor Tiberius, but it was through the influence of this man Sejanus. And Sejanus was a powerful imperial advisor. He was the head of the Praetorian Guard, and he had the ear of Tiberius Caesar. And so because Pilate had a relationship with this man Sejanus, we see him now rise to this position over Judea. But Pilate's main role, his main job as he gets put into position in Judea is simply to control and handle the Jews. All that Caesar wanted was for the Jews just to not create problems in the province of Judea. And so Pilate's almost single role was just to take a politically volatile area and control it. Now, his relationship with the Jewish population was hostile from the start. You would think if you had one job, you might actually make decisions that would help you accomplish that one job. But according to Josephus and Philo, they're Jewish historians, Pilate made several early decisions that deeply offended the Jews. So it's your one job, Pilate. Your job is to come and keep the peace. And he comes right in and he makes several decisions that really deeply offend their religious sensibilities. And so he comes in, Pilate, with one job to do, and he introduces the Roman military standards, which is the bearing of imperial images, graven images, into Jerusalem. So obviously that violates the Jewish law of having no graven images. Not only that, but he used temple funds. To build an aqueduct, money that was only supposed to go to the worship of God, which, by the way, the irony behind that is the Jewish leaders were using temple funds for a lot of different things they shouldn't have. But when the Roman government does it, it's different, right? It has a different weight to it for them. Not only that, but he also, in order to create the peace or to keep the peace, he would often crush Jewish protests. But he didn't come in and just like, hey, let's just round them up. No, he crushed them with brutal force, sometimes killing unarmed protesters. And then the moment of his downfall, AD 31. In AD 31, this friend of his, Sejanus, was actually tried and convicted of treason in the Roman government. And if you know anything about the Roman government, if there's one thing you don't want to be convicted of, it's treason. It's the reason in a minute why we're going to see the Jews bring Jesus to trial on treason. Because if Caesar had one flaw, it was insecurity. And he looked around and he wanted to know that everyone around him was a friend of Caesar. We'll get to that next week. Being a friend of Caesar was essential. And so Sejanus, he was found guilty of treason, and many of his supporters, especially those who were ruling in his name, like Pilate, were left without protection. They were under scrutiny. And so now Pilate finds himself in Judea, in Jerusalem, without the protection of Rome, which makes him more vulnerable to political backlash. And we know that if any unrest breaks out in Judea, not only is his job on the line, but also his life. Later in life, Christian traditions record that Pilate was banished, exiled, and committed suicide in a place called Gaul. The life of Pilate was not a life full of success. It was a life of insecurity. It was a life of looking over his shoulder. It was constant. He was constantly looking over to make sure that Rome wasn't right behind him, ready to stab him in the back. He had one job, and he couldn't even do that. This is the character, this is the mindset of the man now who we see at the center of our passage here in the book of John. A man who is deeply insecure, a man who looks around every corner, a man who is just trying to figure out how to lead. And as the passage goes on, we're gonna see that it really is that character that drives how he responds. So if you have your Bibles, take a look at John chapter 18. We're going to start in verse 28. It says, "Then they, the Jewish leaders, the Sanhedrin, led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. The Roman officials, they didn't begin meeting with the public until 6 a.m. So we believe it was probably 6 a.m. The way that the relationship between the Jewish leaders and Pilate was, they had his ear. If they wanted to see Pilate, he would have made time. And so it was about 6 a.m. And they themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled but could eat the Passover. Now, several things as we talk about this. The Jewish rulers, we may ask the question, well, why, if he was already convicted in Jewish court, why then would they march him over across the city to stand before Pilate? What reason would they have? Well, it comes down to two things. The first is kind of a covering of authority. So the Jewish people, the Jewish leaders, had authority in matters of religion, but they didn't have authority in civil or criminal matters. That was left up to Rome. And so as he was tried in the Jewish court, there was an outcome that they weren't able to bring about. Now, there was no allowable, I say that on purpose, no allowable reason for the Jewish people to put anyone to death. They were not in control over capital punishment. Capital punishment, if you want to enforce that, was only brought by the Romans. Now, it's important to note that that doesn't preclude the Jewish people from capital punishment. In fact, we know that happened, and we'll look at that in a little bit. But what it does do is it makes certain that the Jewish people don't officially put anyone. And really, it was important because Jesus was a high-profile guy. You can't just break the law and put Jesus to death and not have any consequences. So they marched Jesus over to the Romans. Now they walk in, and it says they themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled. So they walk in and they stop short of the door. They walk up and Pilate's ready to greet them, and they're real hesitant to go inside their house. And that's because Gentile residences were considered to be ritually impure. So if you walked into a Gentile house, you were considered unclean back then. And it has a lot to do with the fact that they associated those houses with idolatry. So it was almost certain that Pilate had some sort of graven images, some sort of idols. They worshiped Caesar, and so they would stay outside. Now the next question that comes up is in this last part of the sentence. They wanted to be undefiled. They would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. Now we have to deal a little bit with that because Jesus and his disciples ate the Passover the night before. So what's going on here? Well, there's a lot of conjecture on why this is included. And some scholars have suggested that Jesus' disciples celebrated it a day early. Some say that they celebrated a day early. Jesus knew what was happening, and they celebrated a day early so that they did it without a lamb to be slaughtered. So like a big part of the Passover was they would slaughter the lamb, and Jesus did this a day early with his disciples. The idea would be that either John or the synoptics, but probably John, used it as a symbol. Right, so they did it a day early, and then Jesus now is the Passover lamb. So that's the idea. There's a lot of different views on that. I don't have time to get into all of them, but you can do your research on that if you want to. But that's the one that makes the most sense, is that Jesus is the Passover lamb. We know that to be the case. And so that makes a lot of sense to me. And so as we walk through, we see that now they are standing here before Pilate. And Pilate says, so Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" He says, they answered him, John tells us, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." And John records this as if the doing evil is like this generic charge, right? All they do is they stand before him, and Pilate goes, "Hey, why do you bring him before me? What are the charges?" And John records that the Jewish leaders just simply said, "Because he did evil." Now, that wouldn't be good in any court of law. Like when they ask for specific charges, they're wanting specific charges. Now, Luke actually gives us more details in his passage. And he suggests that in his research, as he looks into the happenings of Jesus, right? Luke was a really great historian, and he looks back into the happenings of Jesus, and he suggests that the Jewish leaders would have responded with the fact that they were charging him with treason against Rome. He was trying to prevent people from giving money to Rome, and he wanted to be king. He claimed to be king. And so why did John just simply mention doing evil? It's because he didn't want to give credence to the charges. He knew that they were trumped up, that they were fake. And so he, as the passage plays out, Luke gives us more details. John paints a picture for us. Jesus is on trial, but it's a sham trial. It is the charges brought against him have no water, they hold no water. And so then Pilate says to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." And now the cat's out of the bag, right? They could have tried him for the religious stuff that they were charging him with, but the Jews show their cards. He says it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. If we're going to get what we want, If we're going to get what we want, we need to bring him to you, Pilate. You're the only one who can give us exactly what we want. And so Pilate tries one of many times, I count 7 times within the passage, 7 times where Pilate tries to give the control or the earnest over back to somebody else. Whether it's the Jews in this case, in the future it's going to be Herod, it's going to be the Jewish people. Pilate is constantly trying to not lead in this situation. He's going to even go so far in the synoptics as to wash his hands of what's happening. He's going to try and remain neutral, but there is no neutrality to be had when it comes to Jesus. And so in verse 32, we get to find out exactly why, and this is where it starts to get really interesting, why they brought Jesus now to the Romans. This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. So we're starting to see, right, Jesus is in full control. It doesn't look like it, right? If you read the story, you're like, oh, that poor Jesus, that poor Savior, that poor God in the flesh. Like, he's just going through this story, and all these horrible things are happening to him. But everything that happens is to fulfill what Jesus has already said would happen. Amen. And so we look back on Jewish history, and we realize that even though they didn't have the authority to bring capital punishment, they often did, as in the story of Stephen. Acts chapter 7, verse 58 says, "Then they cast him out of the city, Stephen, and stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their garments at the feet of a young man named Saul." Now, when you teach this passage, the impetus is always on Saul, right? I mean, Saul was there when Stephen was stoned, but I want to submit to you that for our purposes, the most important thing we can see is that they stoned him. Because in Jewish history, in Jewish law, the means of capital punishment is by stoning. You have an affair, you're stoned. Like that's the consequence. So the Jewish leaders, should they have carried out capital punishment, it would have certainly been by stoning. Now, stoning, that sounds awful. But you know what's worse? Crucifixion. You know what's worse is what Jesus experienced on the cross. And so the Jewish leaders would have stoned him, but that's not what Jesus said would happen. Look at what Jesus says in Matthew 20, verse 17 and following. He says, "And as Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside, and on the way he said to them, 'See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death.'" And so he's telling his story. This is what will happen. Look at verse 19. "And deliver him over to the Gentiles, the Romans, to be mocked and flogged and crucified. And he will be raised on the 3rd day." Well, if he was going to be crucified, it couldn't happen at the hands of the Jews. It had to happen at the hands of the Romans. They were the only ones that used this brutal means of capital punishment. And so we see now Jesus, his own prophecy being fulfilled. He does it again. Look, John 3, in John's own gospel, John 3:14, 2 verses before John 3:16, the most famous Bible verse in the world. Jesus talks about how he's going to die. He says, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up." Well, what's he talking about? Moses, serpent. How does this apply to Jesus? Like, we know he needs to be lifted up, but how is this crucifixion? Numbers chapter 21, one of my favorite stories. I love when things become so clear as you pair the Old Testament with the New Testament. Look at Numbers 21, starting in verse 6. It says, "Then the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people." That sounds awful. so that many people of Israel died. So he sent a bunch of rattlesnakes, all these rattlesnakes crawling around the city. City, by the way, that had walls and defenses. And these snakes are just filling the area and biting people. And it says they bit the people, and so that many people of Israel died. It sounds like an awful place to be. And obviously, if you were in that situation, you would start to cry out as well. Right? God, how do I get out of this situation? We need something that will deliver us. And so that's exactly what happened. The people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord, Moses, that he take away the serpents from us." They just wanted the serpents to be gone. That was their plan. Like, just take it away from us. Does that sound like anything you've ever been through? Like, Lord, just take them away from us. Take my sin, take this. But the Lord said to Moses, "Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten, when he sees it, shall live." So he says, take one like them. Like them, but made perfect. This is going to be out of bronze. And string it up on a pole so that anyone who looks upon that serpent, that bronze serpent, the one that's like them, anyone who puts trust in that serpent, that serpent is going to be the thing that delivers them, when he sees it, they shall live. So Moses made a bronze serpent and set it on a pole. And if a serpent bit anyone, he would look at the bronze serpent and live. And now, Jesus is that serpent on that pole. And I love it, because God uses the Old Testament to beautifully create aha moments in the New Testament. Like he curates the Old Testament, right? He wasn't shooting from his hip. He knew as he sent those serpents what it would represent. He knew as he told Moses to put that bronze serpent up on the pole what it would mean, because he knew that down the road his son would come into the world. He knew that in John 3:14 he would say, just like those serpents, the Son of Man also has to be lifted up. He knew that in the book of Matthew he was going to tell his disciples that he was going to be crucified, and he knew that if that was going to happen, it would have to be at the hands of the Romans. It could not possibly be at the hands of the Jews. And so he uses the Jews to deliver him to the Romans so that Jesus can be that serpent on the pole. And all the while, Pilate is trying to do his darndest to get out of having any responsibility at all. And so he questions Jesus in private. It says, so Pilate, verse 33, entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Like, this is what they're saying. They're saying you're the king of the Jews. And so Pilate really just wants to gauge how much threat is there, right? Is Jesus going around telling everyone that he's the king? Is there political motivation? Is there some sort of challenge that could arise from Jesus? But really, Pilate is starting to sniff that something doesn't smell right. See, it would have been outlandish. It would have been crazy for the Jewish people to turn one of their own over to the Romans. The Jews hated the Romans. It could have been the worst of the worst. They would have handled it in-house. And now all of a sudden, these Jewish leaders get this heart of gold towards Rome. And they're like, you know what? We actually love you. We want to show you so much that we love you that we want to hand over one of our own. And Pilate's going, this makes no sense. And so he asks Jesus, are you actually who they say you are? And Jesus answered, do you say this of your own accord? Or did others say it to you about me? This in the Greek, this is a good question that he's asking. He's asking, is this your idea? Is this your idea? Like, did you come up with this, or are you basing your claims, your thoughts on what somebody else said? And Pilate says, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done? If your own people are willing to bring you to me, it had to be pretty bad. Or there had to be prophecy behind it. John records in John, as Pilate reminds him that his own nation, the chief priests themselves, have delivered him. John writes in John chapter 1, verse 11, he writes with hindsight. So it's not necessarily prophecy, but it's a light that shined on Jesus' entire ministry. He writes that he came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. Now, not only did they reject him, not only did they not receive him, but they actually turned him over to the Romans. And so as we look back on Jesus' ministry, John summarizes it, that Jesus came. His main purpose, look, he spent very little time with Gentiles. Did he save some? Yes. But his main ministry was to the Jewish people. And as we see him move closer and closer to the cross, the words of John in John 1:11 jump off the page of your Bible. Because now we find his own people, and Pilate reminding him, his own people, the people he came for, are rejecting him. And so Jesus answers, in verse 36, Jesus answers, my kingdom is not of this world. You think I'm a threat? You're wondering if I'm going to threaten Rome. My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would have been fighting, which they were. But Jesus said, no, put your sword back in your sheath. My servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews, but my kingdom is not of this world, not for this world or from this world. My kingdom is not from this world. And so Jesus reassures Pilate. He reassures Pilate that he's not a political threat to Rome, that his kingdom comes from somewhere else, and that place is heaven. And so then in verse 37, Pilate said to him, so you are a king? And Jesus answered, you say that I'm a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. We can't read this without realizing that in the Greek, the literal translation is, you said it, not me. You said it, not me. I didn't have to say it. And so Pilate looks at Jesus and says, so you are a king. And Pilate, after Jesus tells him that he came into the world for the purpose to bear witness to the truth, he says, everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. And then Pilate's going to respond to him. And Pilate said to him, what is truth? After he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, I find no guilt in him. And so we can't be sure of the motivation of Pilate in asking this question. Could have been one of a million different reasons. He could have been sarcastic. He could have been genuine. He could have been searching. We can't know the motive behind his question, But the significance is that as he looked at the truth, right, Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life, as he looks at the truth, he asks the question, and he doesn't wait for an answer. He says, "What is truth?" And he walks away, leaving truth behind. And what we're going to see play out is that he absolutely left truth behind. He doesn't wait for an answer. But he does go out, and this is really important. He goes out to the Jews, and he tells them, "I find no guilt in him." Later, in the Synoptics, we find out that Herod said the same thing. And this is essential to the story because in Exodus 12:5, it says, "Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats." The Passover lamb was to be without blemish. And as Pilate walks out to the Jews and he says, "I find no guilt in him," what he's saying is, your lamb is spotless. He's innocent. And Jesus is now preparing to go to the cross and be sacrificed as the innocent Passover lamb. One without blemish. One in which no guilt has ever been found. It's not just symbolic. The words have meaning. I find no guilt in him. Not just Pilate, but Herod as well. And now, as our story continues to play out, we see Pilate continuing to try to pass the buck. He says, "I find no guilt in him, but you have a custom that I should release one man for you on the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" They cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. Remember that. Barabbas was a robber. We're going to come back to that in just a minute. See, what we see in Scripture is that Pilate wanted to pass the buck so much that he was banking on the fact that they would choose Jesus over Barabbas. Barabbas was a robber. Barabbas had committed crimes. He knew that Jesus had not committed any crimes. And when they say, "Not this man, but Barabbas," they're doing the very thing that Pilate never would have expected. And it says, after verse 40, that he continues to try and pass the buck. Right? So all of a sudden, we've got verse 40 happens, and then over in Luke records in Luke 23, verses 6 and 7, that not only that, but he finds out a key piece of information about Jesus. Look, this is when Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. Pilate's like, "I really don't want to make this decision. I really don't want to decide this. Is there any other way?" And he keys onto the fact that Jesus is from Galilee. He's not from Judea, which means the jurisdiction is actually Herod's. And so it says, when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. They were all there for the Passover. And so Herod happened to be there, just out of nowhere. And Herod also declares Jesus innocent. And Pilate tries to appeal to the crowd in verse 38, hoping to bypass the desire of the chief priests and the elders, knowing that Jesus was popular. He was banking on his popularity, right? The triumphal entry, the palm fronds going, "Hosanna, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest." Pilate's trying to play off of that, and he's trying to do what he can to make sure Jesus' blood is not on his hands. So what can we take away from this story? I think as we read this story, it was apparent to me that we often trade the truth for a cheap copy. We often trade the truth for a cheap copy. Look again at verse 40. It says, they cried out again, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a robber. Now, we look at this story, and this is where God blows my mind. You ready for your mind to be blown? So we look at this story, and the man who Pilate, a Gentile, brings out to the people, his name is Barabbas. Barabbas, in Hebrew, is made up of two words, Bar and Abbas, son of the Father. Right? Abba, Father, right? So what we're looking at is Barabbas, the son of the Father. And he stands with Barabbas and he goes, do you want this son of the Father? Or do you want the King of the Jews? Do you want the son of the Father or do you want the King of the Jews? Like, do you want this counterfeit or do you want the real deal? And to a T, they all cry out, not Jesus. Not Jesus. We want Barabbas. We want the counterfeit. Here's another interesting point. Look at Mark 15, verse 7. So we know that John records that he was a robber. It's likely true. It's a rap sheet is what we're starting to build. Mark captures it a little differently. So then, and among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And so, not only was he a robber, but now we have him being a murderer and an insurrectionist. Barabbas, the robber, the murderer, the insurrectionist. And so we're seeing people now choose Barabbas, the robber, murderer, and revolutionary, over Jesus, the true Barabbas, the sinless one. See how this is all adding up? Just wait, I'm not done yet. So Barabbas is a robber, a murderer, and a revolutionary. And Jesus tells us in John 10:10 that the thief, Satan, comes to do what? Steal, rob, kill, murder, and destroy, revolutionize. The choice is between the world and Satan in the flesh, the fake counterfeit Barabbas, and the one true God, Jesus. The choice is between the enemy, the thief who comes to steal, kill, and destroy, and Jesus, the one who came to give abundant life. My mind just goes, God was in the details. We often trade the real thing for a cheap counterfeit. Now, here's what's interesting about counterfeit money. So counterfeit money, it's always been a problem, but it became a real big problem in the 19th century. In the 19th century, as much as 1/3 of our currency was counterfeit. 1/3. Today, thanks to advanced technology and law enforcement, counterfeiting is much less common, but still taken very seriously. In fact, the U.S. Secret Service, you know why it was created? Not to protect the president. It was created to combat counterfeit currency, which is threatening the collapse of the American economy. Now, the issue with counterfeit bills is not that they look counterfeit, right? I could give you this counterfeit bill and nobody's going to worry about this. Like, it's not like, oh, I've got a 50, anybody want this? You could go try and spend it. Nobody's going to look at that and take it serious. The issue is when I pull this out. And I tell you that it's counterfeit. That's not really. I just pulled it out of my wallet. But, yeah, it's really not. Don't turn me in. Pastor had real Why would I do a $1 bill? That would be weird. The issue is not that they look worthless. It's that they look so real that they trick you into believing that there's worth even though it has no value. You get that? Like the Barabbas, the counterfeit, is so real that it tricks you into believing that there's worth and value in it. All the while, there's nothing. There's nothing legitimate about the counterfeit. And in the same way as with the dollar bill, the world is full of spiritual counterfeits. It's full of spiritual counterfeits, ideas, leaders, desires, promises that seem like they're going to give you freedom and happiness and identity and power. And they look so real that they trick you into believing it's the real thing, and we start grasping for these counterfeit things that never have any hope of giving you what you're looking for. The choice for you is between Barabbas and Jesus. And this isn't just a one-time decision. This isn't just something we deal with once and move on. It's not just salvation we're talking about. It's not just putting our hope in the world and rejecting Jesus. This is a pattern that's deep within our humanity. It's a pattern. See, we have Barabbas-like choices that we make every single day. We choose success over surrender. We choose control over trust. Well, that's one that hits me right in the heart. We choose applause over obedience, busyness over intimacy, religion over relationship, and moral performance, box checking, moral performance over gospel transformation. See, we have this pattern within us all to choose the counterfeit over the real thing. And the danger is that the counterfeit looks so real and so enticing. And then the final takeaway is this: Barabbas is us. Barabbas is us. Look, in the story, Pilate brings Barabbas forward, a convicted robber, murderer, insurrectionist. And he says, who do you want? Who do you want to go free? Barabbas or Jesus? Who do you want to go free? The one who actually committed a crime, or Jesus, the sinless one? And to a T, they all yell, Barabbas, give us Barabbas. Not Jesus. We don't want Jesus. We want Barabbas. And so Pilate releases Barabbas. And Jesus now stays in his handcuffs, so to speak. He stays convicted even though he did nothing. And Barabbas goes free because Jesus is not. See, Jesus literally takes the place of the guilty so that the guilty can go free. This is substitution. It's a story of Jesus, what he's about to do on the cross, choosing to take the place of the guilty even though he's innocent. Barabbas went free. No longer had to pay the penalty for his crimes. And when Jesus chooses to take our place, that's true freedom. We're not just the crowd. I've heard this preached. We're the crowd. We're the crowd. We're Barabbas. We're set free by a lamb who took our place. And Jesus is brought in front of the Roman officials because the Jewish people, his own people, wanted him to die the most gruesome death known to man. All the while, the story that plays out is exactly what God had written before the world began. And Jesus would go to the cross and Barabbas would go free. And we have the choice. Are you going to choose the counterfeit, or are you going to choose the real thing? Are you going to choose Jesus, or are you going to choose Barabbas? Jesus went to the cross, Barabbas went free, and we are Barabbas, and that's the good news. That's the gospel. That Jesus, innocent, should be free but chose not to be, so that us, breakers of the law, should be guilty but are set free. That's the beauty of this story, the beauty of our Savior.